Welcome once again. This is Pinnacle Professional College, and today we'll be bringing you another lecture on strategic case study. We've talked severally about different topics on strategic case study, and we are still on internal analysis. And today we'll be looking into analyzing strengths and weaknesses. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, it's easy to do so. Just hit the subscribe button, the red subscribe button. Just hit it so that anytime I post here, you can get a notification. So, analyzing strengths and weaknesses. Analyzing strengths and weaknesses. In this section, we'll be talking about assessing resources and competencies. We'll be looking at techniques for assessing resources and competencies. We will be looking into resource audits. What exactly is a resource audit? We'll be talking about SWOT analysis, preparing a SWOT analysis, how to interpret a SWOT analysis, and we'll also be looking at SOAR analysis. SOAR analysis. Very, very important. So let's begin. Let's start with assessing resources and competencies. In addition to assessing the external environment, including markets and competitors, strategic managers should also assess the internal resources of the entity. Right, so it's basically starting with a nice preamble. Organizations will typically assess the external environment, right? But they should also be able to assess their internal environment. Their internal environment would have their competencies and their capabilities. So the following assessment is required. What are the resources of the entity? Which of these resources are unique? We talked about these things in our previous videos. What value do they provide? Will requirements for resources change as a result of changes in the business environment? We are talking about adaptability here. So would resource requirements change as the environment changes? And then how are the resources used? How are the resources used? So how are the resources used? So in assessing the internal environment, you are looking at the competencies and capabilities of the organization. Now let's look at the techniques for assessing resources and competencies. What are the techniques for assessing resources and competencies? Now, as we've seen, there are several techniques that might be used to assess the resources and competencies of an entity. Right, so we would go through some. Management need to understand how value is created, right, and how value might be lost. An assessment of the value that is created or lost by the entity can be made using value chain analysis. Right, so we are talking about the techniques for assessing resources and competencies. Number 2, management can prepare what we call a capability profile. How do you assess competencies and resources? Remember that we said that a capability is simply a combination of a resource and a competence. So management can prepare a capability profile of the entity. This is an assessment of the key strategic processes that are needed to provide consistently superior value to customers. Right, so another technique is capability profile. And the capability profile can be prepared together with a SWOT analysis. It can be prepared together with a SWOT analysis. In order to prepare a capability profile or a SWOT analysis, management need a thorough understanding of the resources that the entity has. Right? In order to prepare a capability profile or a SWOT analysis, management need a thorough understanding of the resources that the entity has. the value of those resources and the competencies that the entity has acquired in using those resources. I hope that makes sense. So, if you are developing or preparing a capability profile, you do that together with what we call a SWOT analysis, right? And in order to accurately prepare a proper capability profile SWOT analysis, you need a thorough understanding of resources. What kind of resources do you have? What value are those resources offering, right? And what competencies are the organization developing as a result of the usage of those resources? So the process of understanding resource in detail is called a resource audit. A resource audit. So let's delve into what a resource audit is. A resource audit is basically an assessment of the resources of an entity. The word audit, right? Audit is simply examining, to assess, right? So when you say a resource audit, you're basically assessing the resources of an entity. It is carried out to establish what resources there are, which are unique, and how efficiently and effectively they are being used, right? Very, very important. Very, very important. It is carried out to establish what resources there are, which resources are unique, and how efficiently they are being used. So in a resource audit, we first of all need to identify what resources do we have. Which of these resources are unique, because not all resources are the same, and how are the resources being used? A resource audit should identify all the significant resources that are used by an entity. These will vary according to the nature of the entity. In general, however, a resource audit should provide data about the following resources. Right, so it's coming to give us the areas where a resource audit should provide information. Number one is human resources, right? Number two will be management. Number three will be raw materials, etc. But let's take it one by one and explain. So human resources, right? If you are doing a resource audit an audit of human resources, what are the things you are potentially looking for? You are looking for the size of the workforce and the composition of the workforce. When we say the composition of the workforce, you can look at it in terms of the skill set of the workforce, the age of the workforce, the diversity of the workforce, etc. Number two, you can also look at it in terms of the efficiency of the workforce. You can also look at it in terms of the flexibility of the workforce, right? The rate of labor turnover or labor work wastage. And the rate of labor turnover or labor wastage. Then another thing you can look out for when you're talking about resource audits in relation to human resources are the skills, experiences, and qualifications, the salaries and wages, labor relations between management and workers. All these things are things you'd potentially assess when you're looking at human resources. Very, very crucial. Very, very crucial. So let's move on to the next point, which is management. Management. Size of the management team, right? So management is also a resource, And when you're auditing management, what you're potentially looking at is the size of the management team, the performance of the management team, the skills of the management, and what is the management structure? What is the management structure? Now let's look at raw materials. Raw materials. So in raw materials, we also know that raw materials is also a resource. Raw materials is a resource. So what are some of the things that you'd be auditing? or you'd be assessing, you're looking at the cost of the raw materials, the source of the raw materials, the supplier of the raw materials, how available is that raw material, how scarce is it, right? What is the wastage rate of that raw material? Are there any alternative sources of supply? There are different things you can think about when you look at raw materials. Now let's move on to another resource, which is non-current assets or fixed assets. So what are the fixed assets, right? How old is the fixed asset? What is the current value of the fixed asset? How much has been invested into the fixed assets? What kind of condition is the fixed asset in? Is the fixed asset current in terms of technological trends, or it's out of date? All these things are things you can look at when you're auditing non-current assets, because non-current asset is a resource. Now let's move on to intangible resources. Intangible resources. Intangible resources. There are several things you can look into. What kind of intangible resources we have, and what in terms of patents or copyrights. Does the organization have any identifiable goodwill? What is the reputation of the company? This is intangible resource, right? Intangible. What does the word intangible mean? Intangible simply means that it's something that cannot be physically touched. Cannot be physically touched. That's what we mean by intangible. Intangible. So that's basically what it is. So something like reputation, it cannot be physically touched, right? So what is the reputation of the entity? What kind of intellectual rights do they have? Are there any valuable brand names? All these are intangible things. Another resource that we also have here is financial resources. Financial resources. So we are going through all the resources and thinking about how to do a resource audit for each of them. So under financial resources, you are looking at what is the capital of the entity, what are its sources of new capital, what are the cash flows of the entity, what are the sources of liquidity. All these questions come into play when you are assessing financial resources. Then you have internal controls and organization. Now, someone may ask, why is internal controls and organization a resource? It is a resource because if there are no internal controls or lack of proper there's lack of proper organization in an entity, it can create a financial mess. So this is a resource. This is a resource. Right? And for example, if there's no internal control around the use of company cars, people can use it anyhow, and the company loses money. So internal controls is a resource. So it's things you'll be thinking about around internal controls and organization. How well does the entity control the use of its resources? How effective are its controls? How effective are its risk management systems? How well is the organization or is the entity organized? How well is it organized? Is it organized in an efficient way? So these are questions that you would want to ask yourself. Very important. Very, very important. So number one, how effective are controls over the use of assets? How effective are controls over financial reports? How effective are controls over compliance? So basically, we are assessing the general effectiveness of controls, the general effectiveness of risk management systems, and how the organization is structured and organized. Very, very important. Now let's move on to evaluating resources. I'm sure you've heard of the VRIO framework. But we'll be talking about it today. So once you've identified your key resources, you can now evaluate them and the entity's ability to use them efficiently and effectively to create value. Right. So once you've identified the resource, you can evaluate them and use them very well to create value. So a framework has been developed for evaluating resources. For evaluating resources, a framework has been developed, and it's called the VRIO framework. So VRIO simply means, the V means value, I means immutability, R means rarity, and O means organization. Right. So four pillars of this framework. So value, immutability, rarity, organization. So what's value? Let's explain what value means. Because we are evaluating resources here, we would ask the question, does the resource provide value? Does it provide value which leads to competitive advantage? That's number one. Then we move on to immutability. When we say immutability, it comes from the word imitate. Is it easy for competitors to imitate this resource or to imitate this resource or even acquire it? Is it easy or is it difficult? Right. So here it says, would it be costly for competitors to imitate the resource or acquire it? Then you are looking at rarity, how rare a resource is. If it's rare, it means it's unique, it's scarce, right? So in rarity, we are looking at, do other competitors own similar resources or are the resources unique? Then you have O, which is organization. Is the entity organized to exploit its resources to best advantage? How is the organization organized, or how is the entity organized or structured? Because the organization has to be structured in a way to be able to exploit resources. Very, very key. So the VRIO framework, please remember that. Now let's talk about SWOT analysis and strengths and weaknesses. So we described SWOT analysis in our previous videos, and we talked about it extensively. We said that the S and the W stands for strengths and weaknesses, and it focuses on the internal environment. So strengths are basically resources and competencies that an organization has. Weaknesses are simply resources, competencies that are deficient. Weaknesses are deficiencies, strengths are advantages. It's as simple as that. So identifying strengths and weaknesses. Now take note of this. In your examination, the scenario in the case study might require you to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the entity. So in a typical exam, you might be treated to identify strengths and weaknesses. Identify strengths and weaknesses. So you should consider the following. You should consider the following. Number one, for resources, you have to consider all the resources of the entity. And then you identify the ones that are unique. So you should consider unique, you should consider all the resources and identify those that are unique. For competencies, you are looking at how the organization uses its resources, right? So here you are looking at what kind of competencies the entity has, and you are trying to figure out whether there are any core competencies. We talked about these things in our previous lecture, but this is sort of a refresher. So, and the resources you are looking at, you consider all your resources and identify the ones that are unique. And the competencies, you consider all your activities and processes and then you identify whether there are any core ones. Right. You also try to figure out what kind of resources or competencies are lacking. Under capabilities as well, you consider the capabilities of the entity and whether that capability has been successful in delivering value to the customer or has created any cost efficiencies. Very, very important. Very, very important. So I hope you get the picture. If you have any questions, you can simply drop it in the comment section and I'll answer them. So to identify strengths and weaknesses, you should consider the resources, the competencies, and the capabilities of an organization. Right. So you need to figure out, okay, what are the resources for resources, right? What are the resources? Which ones are unique? You know, is there any resource that is deficient or lacking? Right. And then competencies to same. Try and figure out what are the competencies, sorry, and then which of them are core competencies, and is there any deficiency or is there any competence that the organization lacks? Then for capability, you look at the capabilities of the entity and how successful it is in delivering value to the customer or creating cost efficiencies. Pretty straightforward. Now, let's look at preparing a SWOT analysis. How to prepare a SWOT analysis. Preparing a SWOT analysis. Preparing a SWOT analysis. So, when you're preparing a SWOT analysis, it's quite straightforward, right? You create a chart as you see below, right? And this is a typical example of a SWOT analysis. So first of all, what are the strengths of the organization? Remember that strengths and weaknesses focus on the internal environment. Opportunities and threats focus on the external environment. Very, very important. Strengths and weaknesses focus on the internal environment. Opportunities and threats focus on what? The external environment. So anything you are talking about relating to strengths and weaknesses should be in the organization. So typical example of strengths would be extensive research knowledge, highly skilled scientists, advanced equipment, high profit margins. All these things are strengths. Weaknesses, but basically could be the opposite of strength. So high labor turnover, right? People leaving the organization very quickly, poor record of converting research projects into new product development, slow progress, all with research projects. All these things could be weaknesses. Then opportunities and threats exist in the external environment. So here you are looking outside the entity into the external environment. So for opportunities, you are looking at strong growth in total market demand. Strong growth in total market demand. So this is in the external environment. So if there's a growth in demand in the market, that's an opportunity, right? Because you can take advantage of that. New scientific discoveries, these exist in the external environment that have not been fully exploited. Threats could come from competitors. It could come from, strict regulations, etc. So this is a simple assessment when it comes to SWOT analysis. Basically, the organization's context and situation would help you to find these strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats. In order to prepare a SWOT analysis, it is necessary to analyze the internal resource of the entity and try to identify strong and weak points. Analyze the external environment and try to identify opportunities and threats. So when you are doing a SWOT analysis, you are analyzing both the internal environment and the external environment. Very, very important. Very, very important. So for a SWOT analysis, it can be performed by, management, a team of management, can be performed by a group of individuals within the entity, can be performed by a risk management committee, a think tank. All these people can perform a SWOT analysis. Now, how do you use this technique? How do you use this technique? If the case study question in the examination requires you to apply SWOT analysis, the technique is fairly simple to use. You can prepare 4 lists as workings for your answer, 1 for each of the SWOT categories, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So you read through the question carefully and add to each of the lists as ideas come to your mind. You would need to think strategically, right? So when you're given a case study, as you are reading through, you would have jotted down these 4 categories: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And as you are reading through the case of the entity, you're able to, write down points based on each of the categories as you read through the case. Very, very important. You also be required to interpret. Many people are able to go through the text, memorize the text, but they are not able to interpret the result of the analysis. So interpretation is very, very important. So let's talk about interpreting a SWOT analysis. Interpreting a SWOT analysis, very, very important. So an initial SWOT analysis is simply a list of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The significance or potential value or cost of each item is not considered in the initial analysis, and the items are not ranked in any order. So the SWOT analysis, there's no rankings in there. There's no rankings. You are not ranking one strength over the other. You are just writing the strengths of the entity. You are not ranking one opportunity over the other. You are just writing the opportunities down. So one drawback of the SWOT analysis is that it can encourage very long lists of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats without differentiating between them in terms of their significance. So after you've done your SWOT analysis, the next step is to interpret it. So what do we mean by interpreting? When we are interpreting the SWOT analysis, we are trying to identify those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that might be significant. That might be significant. The strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that might be significant, and what their implications for the future might be. So interpretation basically means determining which of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats might be significant, and what are the implications. That's what we are talking about. Implications and ranking. That's what we mean by interpret. So the process of interpretation is simply ranking the SWOTs, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in some order. So anytime you are talking about interpreting, after you've written down your points, all these are strengths, all these are weaknesses, all these are opportunities, you have to sit down and rank them, right? Or give them some order of priority or order of importance. Which one is more important than the other? Which one is more threatening than the other? So that's how you go about it. And after that, you need to determine what the implications are for the future. Another problem with SWOT analysis is that it can be used to identify significant issues, but it cannot be used for evaluation. It cannot be a substitute for a more rigorous strategic analysis. So since these are issues, strategic management should then consider how major strengths and opportunities might be exploited, right? So after you get the information from your SWOT analysis, then what's next? Strengths and opportunities must be exploited to obtain competitive advantage. Weaknesses and threats should be dealt with in order to reduce the risks to the entity. So you see, very, very important. So when you're talking about interpreting, you are going beyond just writing points on SWOT. You are trying to figure out which points are more significant than the other, and what are the implications of these SWOTs for the future, right? And how can we even harness these strengths and opportunities to gain competitive advantage? And how can we deal with these weaknesses and threats to reduce the risks? Very, very important. Now let's move on to what we call the SOAR analysis. So the SOAR analysis is basically an alternative to the SWOT analysis. So SOAR is simply strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. Right? Strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. So the whole idea of the SOAR analysis is that there might be limited benefits in tackling weaknesses. Right? There might be limited benefits in tackling weaknesses. So you might as well not focus too much on it. And also threats may exist, but they may not materialize. So SOAR analysis is focusing on the positive aspects. The positive aspects. So you have strengths, opportunities, which we've explained. So strengths and opportunities can be combined to develop strategies that create aspirations for the future. Aspirations must be measurable in terms of the results that the strategy would bring. Right, so you have your strengths, you have opportunities. They can be combined to create aspirations for the future. Aspirations must be measurable. They must be measurable in terms of the results that the strategy will bring. So SOAR analysis focuses on the outcomes from a strategy and the benefits that they will represent. SOAR analysis does what? It focuses on the outcomes from a strategy, the outcomes from a strategy, and the benefits that they will represent. Very, very important. So SOAR analysis, you are looking at strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. You must know that aspirations must be measurable. They must be measurable in terms of the results that they will bring. So first of all, you need to know why SOAR analysis came. SOAR analysis is focusing on the more positive side because there might not be too much benefits when it comes to tackling weaknesses. Right? There might be a whole disagreement on how serious the weaknesses are and how to put them right. So let's not focus on the weaknesses. Let's not focus on the threats. They might not even materialize. Let's focus on the positive side and harness it. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, you can definitely ask me and I'll respond to you in the comments. If you leave a comment, I'll definitely respond. A car manufacturer has considerable engineering expertise in the design and construction of electric cars, which is a strength. It has identified an opportunity for sales of electric cars, especially in Africa. That's an opportunity. So you are looking at SOAR analysis here. The company, based on this strength and opportunity, decides to launch a strategy for the design of a small range of electric cars with certain countries in Africa as a specific target market. The aim, see the language here, the aim is to develop and grow sales of electric cars in Africa. It is an aspiration, it's a target, it's an aim. Aims are aspirations. The strategy should have a measurable outcome. What did we say? Aspirations should be measurable. The company therefore sets targets for the number of electric cars each year over a period of 10 years. The target market share in Africa in each of those years. That will be the result. So you see, this example summarizes what we've talked about in the SOAR analysis. Very, very important. Now let's do a little chapter review. What are some of the things we've talked about? We've talked about what strategic capabilities are, explaining the concepts, explaining, customer needs from the angle of the 4 Ps. We talked about the critical success factors, we talked about value chain, we talked about customer relationship management, we talked about resources and competencies, we've talked about SWOT analysis and how to interpret SWOT analysis. We've also talked about SOAR analysis, right? So this is what we've learned so far. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do so. Thank you for listening and have an awesome day. Bye-bye.